Hello everybody, this is Alex with the Shrub of Knowledge. We are doing lesson 3 of our Chase Phillips based curriculum. So today we're going to learn about the first and second declensions. In this lesson, you're going to learn the cases, genders, and numbers of nouns and adjectives in ancient Greek. You're also going to get plenty of practice with accent marks, so don't feel too bad if you don't feel like you got enough practice in the last lesson. You're going to begin learning first and second declension nouns and adjectives in Greek. You're going to learn the definite article. And you are going to realize that you are in for a lot of memorization in this course. It's kind of hard to define just in the abstract what a case is. So let's just try to explain what the different cases do. The first case we have is the nominative case, or eonomastike ptosis, or even eutheia ptosis of following a case belonging in a declension, and onomastike coming from onoma, name, and eutheia, just straight, so it's the naming case or the straight normal case. So this case is used for nouns and adjectives as the subjects of finite verbs. So the subject of your sentence, you just put into the nominative case. We'll start with that. The next case we have is the genitive case, and genitive comes from genike ptosis. This is the case of possession or sometimes of separation. So this is cognate with genus, like in genus and species. A genus is, to put it in a, to butcher the philosophy behind it, genitive is a collection, or it's the grouping of certain things. So if you put the word man in the genitive case, it really means of the man or the man's with an apostrophe s. So it's the case of possession or of separation. Next we have the dative case, and when a word is in the dative case, it's best to just put, for now, to or for before it. So the word man in the dative case, to or for the man. This in Greek would be called the dotike ptosis, which comes from giving. So in Latin, dativus, the case of the indirect object, you give to someone, dare, to give, didomi, I give, dotike, the giving case. Next we have the accusative case, or atiatike ptosis, and this is actually a kind of a bad translation from Greek into Latin. It's in Latin, the casus accusativus. So Latin speakers thought that this word was coming from aitiaomai, which means to accuse someone in like a court, or charge them with a crime, something like that, or censure them for something. But it actually just goes back to a simpler aitia, cause. Aristotle uses this word all the time, cause. It's the case of what gets affected by the action of a verb, pretty much. So, but we call in English the direct objects case the accusative case. So you use the accusative case for direct objects and other things. These are just all general uses. There are plenty others that you'll learn just as the course goes on. Lastly, we have the vocative case, or the kleitike ptosis. And kleitike comes from the word for call, kaleo. And this is the case of directly addressing someone. So I could say, the shrub of knowledge, has some videos today. Okay, well, that's the subject of the sentence nominative, but hey, you, Alex, upload some videos. In that case, I would use the vocative for Alex, for me, because it's directly addressing myself, I guess. Maybe that was a bad example. Whatever. I already recorded this. In addition to the case of nouns and adjectives, there's also gender and number to consider. These are other things which affect the form of nouns, adjectives, pronouns. In Greek, there are 3 genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter. And technically, there are 3 different numbers, singular and plural, and also dual. But the dual isn't really used, especially by the time you get to Attic Greek. It's very rare, and it's almost always used for natural pairs of things, like a pair of eyes, or a pair of rivals, or a pair of friends, or a pair of oxen yoked together pulling a plow. It's so rarely used, actually, that Chase Phillip leaves it out, and they only include the forms for the sake of completeness at the end of the book. I'm not going to get into teaching and requiring you to learn the dual forms. I just want you to know that they exist. And regarding gender, number, case, these kinds of things, adjectives agree with the nouns that they modify in case, gender, and number. That's sort of the main thing that you're going to be practicing, is getting things to agree with one another and looking at endings, finding out what doesn't agree so that you have to translate sentences in different ways. So let's get into our first paradigm, our first table. Adjectives of the first and second declension. So let's just start from, I guess, the very basics. An adjective is one of the parts of speech. Adjective is a part of speech. Words which are adjectives modify nouns. So these are words which describe nouns. First and second declensions, these are just groupings of endings. So you have nouns belonging to the first or the second declension, and their endings get combined together for the adjectives because adjectives want to be able to modify something of either declension. So the first declension refers to these feminine columns, and the second declension refers to the masculine and the neuter columns. You'll see in a second where they're coming from. Hopefully you'll find the similarities pretty obvious, but let's just go through. We have kalos, kale, kalon. With adjectives, when you look something up in a dictionary, the typical presentation, the principal parts of an adjective will be the nominative masculine singular, the feminine nominative singular, and the neuter nominative singular. Kalos, kale, kalon. Remember that adjectives have a persistent accent. So we have our accent on the last syllable, and unless we have to, we're not going to move it around. But some things can affect the quality of the accent, whether it's going to be an acute or it's going to be a circumflex. So let's just look at the nominative singular right now. Kalos, kale, kalon. Kalos and kalon both have short ultimas, but kale has a long ultima because eta is always long. Just because your ultima is accented and long does not mean that it's going to be a circumflex. It can, but it doesn't mean it has to. The having to be a circumflex when you're long syllable only applies to the penult when the ultima is short. And so that's the typical pro-perispomenon rule. But it's slightly different with declension, or adjectives and declensions. Looking at the genitive and the dative, you see that all of these ultimas are in fact long, but these ones get the circumflex. It sounds really stupid, I promise I'm not making it up, but this is called the gen-dat-circ rule, or the GDC, I guess. When your ultima is getting the accent for these first and second declension adjectives and nouns, the genitives and the datives will get the circumflex, but not the nominatives and accusatives, even if they're long. So that's why when we look at the accusative singular endings as well, kalon, kalain, kalon, even though kalain, just like the nominative version kalay, has a long ultima, well, it's not genitive or dative, so it gets the acute. Going to vocative, well, vocative is not genitive or dative, so kalay, the feminine vocative singular, still is just an oxytone, still just has the acute on the last syllable. Now, looking through the singulars again in a different way, let's just look at the endings more closely. Let's start with the masculine column. So kalos, kalu, kalo, kalon, kale. Typically, vocatives are exactly the same as nominatives, but this is one of the cases where it isn't. Kale versus kalos. Looking at the dative, notice how there's a iota subscript there. And, well, in Attic, we don't really pronounce the iota subscripts. Sometimes there's a slight I or iota sound, but I just leave it off. But kalo. And you can see how for the other datives, it's common to have that iota subscript. Looking at the neuters now, you can see how they're very similar to the nominatives. In fact, the only differences are for the nominative and the vocative, kalon, and that just looks like the accusative. But for the genitive, dative, and dative, well, they are the same. That makes it easier in one sense. You have fewer unique endings to memorize. It makes it harder in another sense because it might be difficult for you to figure out seeing kalon if it's masculine accusative or if it's neuter of several cases. Looking at the feminine, you can see how they switch from the omicron or the O sound to the E sound, the eta sound. Kale, kalais, kale again, but now with an iota subscript, kalain, kale. I would encourage you to notice similarities when you're learning these things. First, just write down these tables, get familiar with how a table is presented. Masculine, feminine, neuter for the columns, nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, vocative for the rows. But pretty quickly you're going to figure out I'm always writing in this order. So you won't need to mark your columns. And you'll be writing out just your words. And while you're writing out just your words, hopefully you'll start to pick up on things. Oh, my dative's always going to have a iota subscript here. Or you'll remember your gen-dat-circ rule, and I'm only going to get circumflexes on kalos, kale, kalon for the genitives and the datives. Things like that. Now we'll quickly look at the plural tables. Looking at the nominatives, kaloi, kalai, kala. The genitives, all the same. The datives, kalois, kalais, kalois. Not iota subscripts anymore, but proper iotas, which you pronounce. For the accusatives, kalus, kalas, kala. And for the vocatives, kaloi, kalai, kala. Vocatives all the same here as the nominatives. Notice again the neuters, nominatives, and accusatives are the exact same. And this in fact is not just a Greek rule, it's a Latin rule, and I think just a Indo-European rule generally, that neuter words have the same nominative and accusative. I mean, that's just a helpful rule to memorize when you're studying Indo-European languages. Nominative and accusative neuters are the same. If you know exceptions to this, leave a comment. But yeah, memorize this. The table is your friend. The. No, I did not leave off part of this title by accident. We're talking about the definite article, the. You can notice, I think pretty immediately by these tables, that the endings of the definite article are kind of like the endings of the first and second declension adjectives that we saw. Genitives ending in oo, ace, oo, and datives o, a, o, with iota subscripts there. Similarly, the genitive plural, tone, 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 that own ending, ois, ice, ois there as well. Pretty similar. Also, we're following that circ rule where the genitives and the datas are getting circumflex, while nominatives and accusatives, even if the syllables are long, they don't get a circumflex. But there's a curiosity about the nominative singular and plural masculine and feminines. We see both a lack of that tau at the beginning and a lack of an accent mark. Those are just rough breathing signs on top of the omicron and eta for the singular and on top of those iotas in the plural. Ho, he, and hoi, hi for singular and plural, respectively. These words are called proclitics. They don't have an accent. Yeah, there are a few proclitics in Greek. These are, well, pretty common ones. Most proclitics are pretty common, actually. But, yeah, well, just to go through them all real quick. Ho, he, to, tu, tes, tu, to, te, to, ton, tain, to, hoi, hi, ta, tone, 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 tois, tais, tois, tus, tas, ta. Once again, notice that for singular and plural, the neuters have the same nominative and accusative. Pretty useful rule. I'm very happy that in these beginning lessons, Chase Phillips is so thorough. This is another thing that I think many curricula in Greek don't emphasize enough, is position. So we'll start with attributive position. An adjective's position relative to the definite article matters. If you know Latin at all, you're familiar with how it can have such a free, quote-unquote, word order. There are trends, but you have a lot of freedom. You have a lot of freedom in Greek, but notably, you don't have a definite article pretty much in Latin, while in Greek you do. So we'll say pretty much this attributive position is the articles going before the adjective. Here's some examples. Ho, the definite article, the, nominative masculine singular, kalos, if you remember from the previous table, nominative masculine singular, and anthropos, our word for man. Just a quick note, you can see how in this first of three examples, kalos has a grave instead of an acute because it's followed immediately by another word. Whereas in the others, because I'm putting commas there, I'm just going to leave it as an acute. So, ho kalos anthropos, or ho anthropos ho kalos, or anthropos ho kalos. These all mean the same thing. The man, the man. In all these cases, in all these examples, the definite article is before the adjective. Ho kalos, ho anthropos ho kalos, anthropos ho kalos. By far the most common is this first one, ho kalos anthropos, the good man, but you will see the others as well. But these all mean the man. You can also, and this is why it's useful to know position, you can also use things other than adjectives. So we have hoi noon. You can just say hoi noon, the now. The definite article hoi has a lot of information in it. We know that it's masculine and plural. From that information, we can supply something like anthropoi, the men of today, the men of now. And we can put in something like another noun, ho anthropou philos, anthropou genitive singular, the man's friend. And we know that anthropou modifies philos because it is in attributive position with the noun that the article is modifying. Another thing worth mentioning is the generic article. In French and Romanian and a lot of languages, you use the word for the, or the form for the blank, to talk about that thing as a class. So if you're talking about man, man is good, you would use the generic article, the man. Next, in contrast, we have predicative position. It's a position of stuff when there isn't the definite article before it. This positioning can be used to make a complete sentence with the verb to be implied. So, in a fun way, we actually don't have to worry about learning verbs yet. We just have to focus on nouns. Here are a couple of examples. The man is handsome, kalos ho anthropos, or ho anthropos kalos. In both of these cases, you can see that the definite article and the noun it's going with are kind of closed off. And outside of it, outside of this closure, is the adjective. There isn't a definite article before the adjective. It's outside of this definite construction. So, the man, we predicate pretty or handsome off of ho anthropos. And same over here. If you've studied Aristotle's categories, these are all categories of predication. What different things do you predicate off other things? Always implying the verb to be, pretty much, or some other linking verb. Some other stuff to be aware of. Oftentimes the article takes the place of a possessive, elebeto biblion. He took the book, literally, but we can also translate this pretty legitimately as he took his book, or she took her book. There's also a mende construction, which introduces a kind of antithesis. So on the one hand, then on the other, men on the one hand, de on the other. Ho men, ho de. There isn't a noun explicitly stated here, but ho, if you remember from the example, hoi noon, the men of today, ho has a lot of information in it. It has more information than just the English word the. We know that ho has to be nominative, masculine, and singular. So the man, probably. But the one man versus the other having this antithesis. One man does this, but another man does this. So we can imply the noun. Also notice how men and de come after ho. Men and de don't want to be the first word in their sentence. They want to be in a second position. Hoi men, hoi de, another example, but now we're in plural, so some men, blah blah blah, other men, blah blah blah. And we don't have a real indefinite article in Greek. There are words that are indefinite, but there's no indefinite article. So don't worry about a or on. If you want to say a man, it's just plain anthropos. Finally, we can talk about first declension nouns. And here we have gnome, which means opinion. Here's the table. Gnome, gnomes, gnome, gnomane, gnome, gnomai, gnomone, gnomais, gnomas, gnomai. Looking at the top, gnomes, gnomes, hey. Gnome, gnomes, hey. Gnome is the nominative singular, gnomes is the genitive singular, and hey is the definite article. This is the typical dictionary listing for a noun, nominative singular, then the genitive singular, and then the definite article which corresponds to the gender. In this case, hey tells us that the word gnome is feminine. Looking at the singulars, we can see the endings a, ace, a, ain, a. These are very similar to the endings that we saw for first and second declension adjectives for the singular. Looking at I, own, ice, us, I. These are also rather similar. What's interesting about this word is the accentuation. Let's just go down the list. Starting at the top left, the nominative singular, gnome. Our principal parts, that is the dictionary entry at the top, tells us pretty clearly that we want to have our accent on the penult. If you remember, nouns have a persistent accent, so our accent wants to persist on the penult. Notably, our penult is long, because omega is always long. So we have an accent on a long penult. That means we have a choice of whether or not to have our word be a paroxytone or a properispomenon. Looking at the ultima for gnome, eta is always a long vowel. Eta is long, our ultima is long, so it doesn't matter. Our penult has to have an acute if it has any accent mark, so gnome. Looking at the genitive, well, eta sigma is a long syllable, so again, the genitive singular, like the nominative singular, is a paroxytone, the acute on the second to last syllable. Similar situation with the dative. Note that the eta has an iota subscript. Any vowel with an iota subscript has to be long, but eta is always long anyway, so gnome, paroxytone. And same deal with gnomes, or gnome and gnomane, I should say, and gnome. Things get a bit more interesting in the plural. Gnomai. Notice that we have a properispomenon. Yes, alpha iota is a diphthong, so in that sense, it's long. But if you remember anthropoi being the weird example of a omicron iota at the end, but anthropoi being a properoxytone, that is having an acute on the antpenult. For purposes of accentuation, these final I's and O's are very, very often short. For these kinds of nouns, first, second declension, they are short for accentuation purposes. So, gnomai, we have accent on the penult. The penult is long, and our ultima, for purposes of accentuation, is short. Therefore, gnomai must be a properispomenon. Things are really weird when we shift to the genitive plural. gnomon. This seems to violate, in a way it does, the rule about nouns having persistent accent. We know that it's okay in gnome and its various forms to have our accent be on the first syllable, which is penult. I mean, look at all of the singular forms. They all have the accent on the penult. But gnomon pushes it forward. Well, here's why. Originally the form was gnomaon. It wanted to have the accent on the antepenult in this form, but because the ultima was long, both because there's an omega and for long for accentuation purposes, this is not an exception to the rule. Because the ultima was long, the accent was brought forward. And what happened was this alpha and this omega combined. And so that's why you have, in the genitive plural form, the circumflex on the last syllable. This is a general rule for all first declension nouns. No matter what, in the first declension, for nouns, the word will be, in the genitive plural, a perispomena. I'm not saying that all feminine nouns will be perispomena. I am not saying that first and second declension adjectives in the genitive plural will be perispomena. What I am saying is this and only this. First declension, genitive plural, perispomena. That's it. Looking at gnomais, the dative plural. Yes, final alpha iota is considered short for accentuation purposes, but final iota, alpha iota sigma is not. So we have a long ultima, and so our word is just a paroxytone. Looking at the accusative, we can see here that gnomas is another paroxytone, but we remember that alpha can be long or short, but because gnomas is a paroxytone, we know that alpha is long. Because if alpha were short, gnomas would be a properispomenon, but it's not. And our vocative plural is the same as our nominative plural. Just to reiterate why gnomon, why a perispomena. This is a contracted form. The original was gnomaon. They got smushed together, resulting in gnomon. And the important thing to remember is all first declension genitive plural nouns are perispomena. That includes masculine first declension, and this doesn't mean first and second declension adjectives, only first declension genitive plural nouns. Here's another paradigm. Second declension, your typical masculine second declension, logos, logu, ha. That would be the dictionary entry, the principal parts, nominative singular, genitive singular, and the definite article to tell you the gender. If you're Christian or you've read John chapter 1, you're familiar with this term logos. It's kind of ubiquitous in Christian theology and Platonism, any philosophy, whatever. But nothing here actually too surprising. The endings are just like the first and second declension adjective endings. I'll just go through them real quick. Logos, logu, logo, logon, loge, logoi, logon, logois, logus, logoi. And notice how here we don't have the genitive plural be a perispomena because this is not the first declension. Really, the only thing of note here is that the vocative is different than the nominative in the singular. And I guess what's nice about a word like this is because the penult is short, you don't actually have to figure out whether you want your word to be a paroxytone or a properispomenon, because this word can't be a properispomenon because the penult is short, and so it can only take an acute. Here we have another second declension word which ends in omicron sigma. Hodos, hodu, hey. What does that tell you? This is actually a feminine word. And I mean, pretty much the same, except now we have the persistent accent on the ultima. So hodos, hodu, hodo, hodon, hode, hodoi, hodon, hodois, hodus, hodoi. Same endings, not the same gender, but we know the gender just from the nature of the word itself. Well, we know the gender from this hey in the dictionary entry, but notice the trend, the gen dat circ rule, which I'm kind of embarrassed to say because it sounds so made up, but even though the accusative plural has a long ultima and the accent's on the ultima, it's not the genitive or the dative. So the accusative plural is an oxytone, whereas the genitive and dative plurals, as well as the genitive and dative singulars, these are perispomena. But the endings are the same. Yeah, nothing too surprising here. Now we are on to another second declension word, doron, doru, ta. The ta at the end tells you this is a neuter, and this is actually the neuter variation on the second declension. Starting with a nominative singular, doron, doru, doro, doron, doron. Moving to the plural, dora, doron, dorois, dora, dora. We are following the normal Indo-European rule where nominative and accusatives will be the same for the singular and the plural. And I think this is pretty good practice for some long accented penult rule practice. With doron, the ultima is short, penult, which gets the accent, and we're dealing with a noun, so a persistent accent. With doron, we have a properispomenon because the ultima is short. For doru and doro, the genitive and the dative, our ultimas are long, and so our word is now a paroxytone. And nominative being the same as the accusative and the vocative, well, they're exactly the same for the same reasons. Looking at the nominative, accusative, and vocative plurals, I'll do a pause real quick. You figure out whether the alpha at the end is long or short. Okay, well, you had your chance. Now I'm just going to tell you. The alpha at the end is short, and you can tell because if it were long, then dora would be a paroxytone. But in fact, it's a properispomenon, which can only happen if our ultima is short. So the alpha is short at the end. And for the same reasons we've been practicing, we have doron and dorois for the genitive and the dative plurals be paroxytones, omega nu, always long, omicron, iota sigma, long syllable. Yeah. Let's look at some vocabulary now. This is all in your book, but it's good for us to go through this together anyway. First, anthropos, anthropou, ha, which means man, or more generally, a human being. And notice how I pronounce the genitive as anthropou. That's because the ultima in the genitive singular, that is the ending, omicron upsilon, that's long. And we remember that one of our accent rules is, aside from those exceptions we mentioned, that you can't have an accent on the antepenult when your ultima is long. And looking at these endings, this is why they give you these forms. The first two things tell you what declension to use, and the last thing tells you what gender. Gender is not necessarily tied up with the declension. They're just sort of trends. But this os u ending, it tells you this is your masculine or feminine second declension paradigm. Same with bios biu, ha, life. The os u there tells you use that second declension that we talked about, where the nominative is os. Gnome, gnomes, hey, opinion, we've already talked about. Same with doron, u, ta, gift. Ergon, ergu, ta. This also belongs to the same paradigm as doron, because you can see here, the first part ends in on, second ending is u, and as you'd expect, neuter ending, or neuter end principal part, that is, it's a neuter word. And then we have logos, logu. Plenty of ways to translate this. A problem for many theologians who aren't writing in ancient Greek. That is, most of them. But yeah, just some etymologies here, or derivatives, that'd be helpful. And your sister studied anthropology in college. Comes from anthropos. Maybe your brother studied biology. Bios, life. Maybe your first cousin twice removed is a Gnostic. Well, gnosis, knowledge, gnome. Maybe your uncle's named Theodore. Theos, noron. Gift of God, God's gift. Maybe your vegan cousin is really into renewable energy. En ergon, within or inside of action, in action. Ergon, activity. Energy is a way to sort of measure, well, without getting into the specifics of it, some kind of action. And then maybe your annoying YouTube guy that you're subscribed to is really into logic or something. Logos. So, oh, that reminds me. Leave a like on this video and subscribe. Some more nouns. Metron, metru, ta. Neuter, second declension. We get the word in English meter from it. It means measure or mean, perhaps the golden mean in Aristotle, or Ariston metron, the best mean. But yeah, we get the unit of measurement for pretty much everywhere but the United States of America and Liberia. Next, hodos, hodu, hey. This is the uncommon feminine of the second declension. English words which come from this are pretty not common, but say you're afraid of travel, hodophobia, or you study paths and roadways, you're into hodology. Yeah. Next, a neuter word like metron, padion, padiu, ta, child. Yeah, pediatrician, that ped or pied, and then iatros, doctor, a child doctor, pediatrician. Philos, philu. Think of philosophy, loving wisdom, Sophia. Chronos, chrono, second declension, masculine. I think chronometer is a word, a measurement of time or device which measures time. Lastly, psyche, psyches, hey, soul, psyche in English, direct taking from Greek psyche, but psychology, the study of the soul or the mind, personality, all that. Moving away from nouns and towards adjectives, we have agathos, agathé, agathon, which means noble or good. Next, something a bit more interesting, athanatos, athanaton. Deathless. Notice how there are only two forms given. So with certain compound adjectives, and quite especially those which have an alpha privative, meaning you put an alpha at the beginning and it means not. Thanatos means death, but athanatos means deathless. With these certain compounds, the masculine and the feminine look the same. So that's why we're only getting two forms here. And you'll see how this works in the sentences if you've not already looked at them. Next, aristos, ariste, ariston, which means the best, or just best. Kalos, kale, kalon. This also means good, but good in a slightly different sense than agathos. This means good as in beautiful or handsome. And we have koinos, koine, koinon, common. You've heard of Koine Greek probably, common Greek. Just a couple of more here. Sophos, sophe, sophon, which means wise. Philosophia, I should say. Love of the wise, love of wisdom. And lastly, chalapos, chalape, chalapon, difficult or harsh. Here are some other words. There's este or estin, and you use este when the next word doesn't start with a vowel, and use estin when the next word does start with a vowel, or when estin is ending a sentence, kind of like a versus on in English. And this is the singular for is. He, she, it is, namely third person singular. We have an adverb, ae, which means always. We have gar, which is a conjunction meaning for or so. And this is a postpositive conjunction, meaning it's never in first position in a clause. It goes after some kind of word, and you'll see how that works shortly. This is familiar to you already, hoheto, which is the, that is the definite article. And we have u, uk, u not having its own accent, uk not having its own accent, and uk not having its own accent. These are all proclitics, just like ha and hey. But we change the ending based on the word that follows. If after u, after the word for not, you have a word which starts with a consonant, then use u. If the word starts with a vowel, which has a smooth breathing mark, then use uk. But if you have a rough breathing mark, you use the aspirated form of this palatal. You switch that kappa to a ki, resulting in uk. And I think that uk is the only word in Greek which ends in a kappa, but I'm not really sure. Okay, hold it. We're about to go into the readings and some exercises. I really want you to do them before you watch this video. I'm not gonna get into the English composition from the Greek because there are just too many ways to do that, and I'd like to grade stuff personally, or you can have someone else grade them. But for Greek to English, seriously, give it a try first. You are going to learn way better if you do. So, first sentence, athanatos he psuche. There are, well, a lot of things that we're going to learn about analyzing sentences, a ton of method and grammar. We have to figure out, I guess, first, what part of speech each of these words is. Athanatos is an adjective. Remember what adjectives do. Adjectives modify nouns. He is another adjective. A definite article, articular adjective. It also modifies a noun. And then psuche, we have a noun. Next thing, notice what position athanatos is in. It is in the predicative position. It does not have the word he before it. He is going with psuche, but it doesn't have anything to do with athanatos. Now you might think, well, I've learned my endings. Os is the masculine ending, and these are feminine. Well, athanatos, having this alpha privative, is just two termination, meaning it only has two different columns of ending for the singular or plural. So, athanatos is both the masculine nominative singular and the feminine nominative singular ending. And so it is in attributive position with this unit here, he psuche. So I put this together. Typically, I would put a big S over it for subject. And then what I would do is put a P above athanatos. And this is the predicate. So we would call this a predicate nominative. It's nominative because we are saying that these things are equal. This agrees with our subject in case, gender, number, and we're supplying our verb with this equal sign to be. So the soul is immortal. And that is our translation. If I can pull it up. There. Sorry about that. The soul is immortal. Our next sentence. Kalapa ta kala. Let's do the very basic stuff first. Kalapa. This is an adjective. Ta, definite article, and kala. Same order of normal adjective, articular adjective, and, well, something. Kala is an adjective, but this we would call a substantive adjective. A substantivum is the old-fashioned Latin term for something which is a noun. So this is a nouny adjective. Ta kala, the good blank, the good something. Look at your definite article table and identify what things the word ta can be. Well, I'm assuming you paused it. I'm going to give you the answer. Ta can be either nominative or accusative, neuter, plural. And since accusative is used for the direct object, we're going to say this is nominative. So neuter, plural, though, that means usually things, the good things. And we supply are because kalapa is in predicative position. Good things or noble things. And this is a good example of a generic article. Noble things are difficult. And there we go. Next we have metron ariston, and the footnote helps you out with this. The golden mean, but literally the best measure. Next sentence, and I'm assuming you've done what I told you, and you've looked at them already, and so you've also looked at the footnotes in Chase and Phillip's Tosopho, Xenon, Uden. Looking at so-fo, the only options for this are dative, singular, masculine, or accusative. I'm more inclined to think the wise man versus the wise thing, but we can consider both options. Xenon, we have a bit more options. That omicron new ending, it's either masculine singular accusative, or it is neuter singular, nominative, accusative, or vocative. Well, there's nothing which could introduce a direct object in this sentence, and we're not addressing anyone. So I'm going to say it can't be vocative or accusative, and therefore it's nominative, and so it's nominative, neuter, singular. And we're also just given by the gloss that Xenon is strange. Uden also, we're told, is nothing. We can supply the verb is, so nothing is strange. And then tosopho, not a common use of the dative, is some kind of reference. So nothing is strange to or for the wise. The wise what? Well, we can say the wise thing, but I want to say the wise man. Man, nothing is strange or foreign to the wise man. For our next sentence, I'm assuming that you've looked at the gloss, which is just fine. We have koina ta ton philon. So the gloss goes ahead and tells us that ta is the neuter plural article used as the substantive. Well, remember that substantive is a fancy way to say as a noun. So ta is being used as a noun. Let's just look at each word. Koina, ta, ton, philon. Koina and ta both have two options for what they could be. Both those options are neuter plural. Ta, we're told, is nominative, and as you would expect from the sentences we've done so far already, koina is also nominative. Ton, philon is pretty obviously genitive plural, but note the position of koina. It is before the article, so it is in predicative position. The only thing in attributive position, that is the only thing with the article before it, is ta, ton, philon. So the of the friends. Ta being used substantively, the things of the friend. Things, neuter plural. And the gloss tells us, therefore, the property of friends, but literally the things of friends. And because koinon is in predicative position, we can go ahead and supply the verb to be. Our next sentence, chronos iatros ton ponon estin. We are told by the gloss that iatros is a doctor or a physician. One English derivative being psychiatry. We also have podiatry, also pediatrician, pod, foot, pais or paidion, child. Chronos, the only option there, and this is nice to have only one option. The only option for chronos is nominative singular. Iatros, similar ending. I'll just identify this as nominative singular as well. And then ton ponon estin.
this tau, omega, nu, and ponon, also ending in omega, nu, genitive, and genitive plural, and we're told of pains. So we have ho and chronos, the time, the word doctor, of pains, and the verb for to be. When you have two different nouns being linked together by a copulative verb, that is the linking verb, a pretty common trend is that the one which is the subject gets the definite article. Ho chronos iatros ton ponon estin. So, the time is the doctor. We can go ahead and translate it as the doctor. We just are following the rule of distinguishing the predicate from the subject by not giving the predicate the article. The doctor, or the healer, the physician of pains. And I'm going to go ahead and assume this definite article for chronos is a generic article. So time is the healer of pains. You're seeing kind of a different use of the genitive here. Pain doesn't possess, it's not the owner of the healer. Rather, the genitive is being used in an objective way. So I would say this is an objective genitive. Meaning if you took the noun here, healer, as a verb, heals, its object would be pains. So heals pains. The object of the action associated with this noun is the pains. So not a genitive possession, but a genitive of an object, an objective genitive. Here's a bonus from the Gospel of John, which goes over how definite article is sometimes used to distinguish subject versus predicate in a copulative sentence. And this is just the end of the first verse. Kai theos ein. That's supposed to be a circumflex there. It's just my font. Ho logos. Kai theos ein ho logos. If you translate this just word for word, and God was the Word, that's fine, but we have two nouns here and a linking verb, a copulative verb. Which one's getting the article though? Logos. So my tendency is to say the subject of the sentence is actually logos, even though it comes after theos. So, and the Word was God. Next sentence, logos God ergo skea. This is actually a quote from the atomist philosopher Democritus. Logos, nominative singular, skea, by the gloss you're told shadow, also nominative. We have two nominative nouns here. We don't have an article to help us out, so we'll just treat it like a puzzle and figure it out ourselves. We're seeing the word gar here, and we take notice of its position. It's a postpositive word, meaning it doesn't want to be in the beginning of the sentence, but postpositive, it is used after where you translate it. So with these kinds of postpositive words, just take the word and draw an arrow, something, so that you just move it up here. So when you translate these postpositive words, just move them back a little bit. And gar is in a very common place in second position here in the sentence. Ergo, we have genitive singular, and we could take it, I guess, with either logos or skea. I think I'll just take it with what is closer. If in doubt, try proximity That's a good way to start. So I could translate it just going word for word. For word is shadow of action. I guess word or talk is the shadow of the action you're talking about. For word is the shadow of deed. I'll let you interpret that however you want. With our next sentence, we're getting a bit more complicated. Lupes iatros estin anthropois chronos. Our first time using the dative here on anthropois. Lupes, genitive, from lupe. I like to be able to provide English derivatives for things, or even Latin, but I don't know if there are any for lupe. Also, this is a word of doubtful Indo-European origin. I don't know any cognates in any languages, but we're familiar with iatros already. But the accentuation is a bit weird. You would think that the acute on the ultima would be a gra because it's followed by another word, but estin is one of these enclitics we talked about, and it sometimes does funny things to the accentuation of words which come earlier. You don't have to worry about these rules right now. In fact, they're going to come quite a bit later, chapter 11. If you want to learn these rules, go right ahead. It's not too big of a deal, but it's not going to be necessary. Yeah, so, and it's estin rather than este, because the next word begins with a vowel. So you're trying to avoid that diaresis of ending a word with a vowel and then beginning the next word with a vowel without a pause between. And then chronos, another nominative. So we have two nominatives and the verb to be, or the verb is. So that kind of tells us we're going to have one be the subject and one be predicated of this subject. Doctor, like I said, so we can say the doctor is time, or time is the doctor. Lupe is a genitive. We've already seen iatros with the genitive, and lupes is right next to iatros, so I'm thinking of taking that together. Also in the objective sense, the healer of pain is time. Well, okay, that makes pretty good sense already. But anthropois, we remember that there are plenty of uses for the dative. Indirect object is the main, I guess, first one, where you get the word dative, casus dativus, the dative case, or he to the k, ptosis, the dative or giving case. You think indirect object. Well, we don't actually have a verb here that would allow us to use an indirect object. But we remember that there's a sort of reference or interest sense of the dative for man. So time is the healer for men of pain. The doctor of pain for men is time. Both are okay translations, and here you go. For sentence 9, we have something similar to the previous quote from Democritus. Eidolon ergon estin anthropou logos. Eidolon, idol, a neuter word, so nominative in this case. Logos, also nominative, has to be nominative. Ergon and anthropou, both genitive, the former being plural, the latter being singular. And we have our linking verb, estin. So if I were to mark this up, put a big equals sign on top of estin. Because you don't have an article with one of these nouns versus another, you can take it one of two ways. Likeness of this man's word. That's how I took it. But you could also just reverse these if you wanted, it's fine. But I would group them together if you were marking things up in your book. And the way that I did it here, subject goes here, predicate, nominative. I often just do P, but you do PN. And these genitives going with what they are modifying, or what they're genitives of, I should say. And finally, our last reading. Metron tu biu to kalon u to tu chronu megos. Let's just go through it together and I'll show you my markup process. Gar, we have a conjunction, so I'll put a C there. And remember it's post-positive, so it would really go over here in your English translation. We have metron, which is a noun. And then to kalon. Well, to is a definite article. And we've seen it before with an adjective, and so it's being used sort of substantively. The neuter here, neuter singular with the article, and then an adjective often makes things generalized and abstracted. The beautiful here, which is the subject of my current thesis, the beautiful. But we do have the article, and metron doesn't, so I'm inclined to take this as the subject. The beautiful is the measure. Well, where are we going to take this to? Biu. The beautiful of life is the measure, or the beautiful is the measure of life? Well, that's kind of how I want to take it. Beautiful is measure of life. So my predicate over here, and genitive modifying this. For the beautiful is the measure of life. Not u to tu chronomekos. We have a larger thing going on here. To cannot be genitive. It is either nominative or accusative, neuter, singular. Tu chronu is genitive singular masculine. So either that thing of time, or we need to find a neuter noun, and that is mekos. The gloss tells you this is neuter. It's pretty helpful. Just because something ends in omicron sigma doesn't mean it's masculine or it's second declension. I'll give you another example, the word for genus in the genus species distinction, genos, where we also get the genitive case, genike. That's a third declension neuter word, and you'll get to that declension pretty soon. But the length of time, we can say this is sort of an in opposition to, antithesis with, our first subject. So we have sort of an adversative asyndeton here almost. Asyndeton not having a conjunction. U is just an adverb, not a conjunction. And Greek does this often, but English does too. You can supply from the sentence the same thing. So I'll just give you an example in English. Yesterday I went to the store, today nowhere. You know what I mean. I went to the store yesterday, but I didn't go to the store today. I went nowhere today, but I went nowhere today. nowhere today is not a sentence, but from the previous sentence, you understand the context. And so in your translation, you can reflect that, or you can choose not to. Let's just see. For the measure of life is its beauty, not the length of it, its time. And I guess the last thing to point out is its. An example that we had, he took the book, el biblion, he took his book. Just to make our translation a bit more dynamic, I'm taking the definite article to not just be le, but also it's, referring back to life. So, a few things going on in this sentence. Adversative a syndeton having the genitive tu chronu in attributive position. The genitive, which describes things, definite things, doesn't have to be in attributive position. I mean, look at the top tu biu. It's not with metron in attributive position, but when you do have a genitive which is in attributive position with something, like in the case of to tu chrono mekos, yeah, you definitely want to take it with the noun it is an attribute of. So I think now is a good time to, with the knowledge you have, if you didn't give these sentences a shot, go ahead and give them a shot. Or if you did go ahead and try to give a Greek translation of these English sentences, go ahead and pause the video and revise your sentences with new things that you've either learned or come to a better understanding of. I'm not going to give you my own translations of these. If you want, I can review your work, but I can say now just a few things that will probably be useful. With these sentences, take note, I guess, most of all of what they have in parentheses and why they have things in parentheses. With sentence number 1 and 2 and 3, we have the word are in parentheses. So you don't actually have to know the plural form for he, she, it is. You can supply it. And how do we do that? Well, by being very careful with how we put with the positioning of words. So just remember what position you need to use to make these copulative or linking sentences. Men here in sentence 4. Why is it in parentheses? Well, remember how things can be used substantively, and to specifically say men, what kind of adjective, what gender, what number do you want to use for that? And then in here, we have a word for common, and very often there isn't a direct translation for any idea. In English you might use a preposition, in Greek you might not. In one language you say it one way, say an idea one way, in another language a different way. Totally normal. As you go along, you'll see how, well, Greek has its own unique way of expressing ideas. Eventually you'll develop a sprachgevoel of the language, an innate sense of how things should work, but try to put aside your preconceived notions from English about how things work. There are obviously going to be a lot of similarities, and I'll try to bring those out. Both English and Greek are Indo-European languages, but Greek is a different family within the Indo-European language tree. The Hellenic languages and stylex is a species within the genus Indo-European, and Attic from Athens around the time of Socrates and Plato. It's a species of the genus Greek. So it's different than English, but similarities. Again, in sentence 6, is in parentheses because you don't actually need it. And, well, number 6 just gives you a hint to use the dative for a child. And, well, with the word "a" right here, remember that there isn't an indefinite article in Greek, so how would you do this? With our next sentence, we're getting a bit more complicated. Lupes iatros estin anthropois chronos. Our first time using the dative here on anthropois. Lupes, genitive, from lupe. I like to be able to provide English derivatives for things, or even Latin, but I don't know if there are any for lupe. Also, this is a word of doubtful Indo-European origin. I don't know any cognates in any languages, but we're familiar with iatros already. But the accentuation is a bit weird. You would think that the acute on the ultima would be a gra because it's followed by another word, but estin is one of these enclitics we talked about, and it sometimes does funny things to the accentuation of words which come earlier. You don't have to worry about these rules right now. In fact, they're going to come quite a bit later, chapter 11. If you want to learn these rules, go right ahead. It's not too big of a deal, but it's not going to be necessary. Yeah, so, and it's estin rather than este, because the next word begins with a vowel. So you're trying to avoid that diaresis of ending a word with a vowel and then beginning the next word with a vowel without a pause between. And then chronos, another nominative. So we have two nominatives and the verb to be, or the verb is. So that kind of tells us we're going to have one be the subject and one be predicated of this subject. Doctor, like I said, so we can say the doctor is time, or time is the doctor. Lupe is the genitive. We've already seen iatros with the genitive, and lupes is right next to iatros, so I'm thinking of taking that together. Also in the objective sense, the healer of pain is time. Well, okay, that makes pretty good sense already. But anthropois, we remember that there are plenty of uses for the dative. Indirect object is the main, I guess, first one, where you get the word dative, casus dativus, the dative case, or he to the K, ptosis, the dative or giving case. You think indirect object. Well, we don't actually have a verb here that would allow us to use an indirect object. But we remember that there's a sort of reference or interest sense of the dative for man. So time is the healer for men of pain. The doctor of pain for men is time. Both are okay translations, and here you go. So thank you for watching this intro Greek video. Like and subscribe to Shop of Knowledge. Leave comments, suggestions below. See you next time for our 4th lesson.